Nancy Pelosi thought she was untouchable. For 37 years, she'd crushed challengers, silenced critics, and accumulated power most politicians only dream of. She'd survived scandals that would have ended lesser careers. She'd made enemies of presidents and emerged stronger. She was the queen of the Democratic establishment, the most feared woman in Washington. And on that stage, under those bright CNN lights, she believed she was about to destroy Tulsi Gabbard once and for all. The setup was perfect. CNN had billed it as a conversation about the future of the Democratic Party. The promotional materials showed Pelosi as the wise elder, Gabbard as the misguided defector. The audience was carefully selected, heavy on establishment Democrats who'd spent years watching Pelosi wield power like a weapon. The moderator, Jake Tapper, had his questions prepared, designed to let Pelosi dismantle Gabbard's credibility piece by piece. Every detail was orchestrated to make this Pelosi's moment of triumph. She'd spent days preparing. Her team had compiled opposition research on Gabbard, thick binders full of voting records, controversial statements, anything that could be weaponized. They'd rehearsed responses to every possible attack. They'd planned the facial expressions, the dismissive gestures, the patronizing tone that had intimidated countless Democrats over the decades. Pelosi had even practiced in front of a mirror, perfecting that particular smile that said, "I'm about to end your career, and I'm going to enjoy it." What Nancy Pelosi didn't know, what her consultants and handlers and yes-men never told her, was that Tulsi Gabbard had been waiting for this moment for 6 years. 6 years since she'd first arrived in Congress as a young representative, full of idealism about public service. 6 years of watching Pelosi operate behind closed doors. 6 years of seeing the deals, the threats, the money changing hands, the way principles were discarded whenever they conflicted with power. 6 years of taking mental notes, saving documents, building a case. And unlike every other Democrat who'd thought about challenging Pelosi, Tulsi had nothing to lose. She'd already left the party. She'd already been branded a traitor by the establishment. They'd already tried to destroy her reputation, her career, her credibility. They'd thrown everything at her and she was still standing, which meant she was free. Free to say what everyone in Washington knew but was too afraid to speak out loud. Free to expose the corruption that had made Nancy Pelosi worth $120 million on a government salary. The lights went up, the cameras rolled. Jake Tapper welcomed the audience and introduced his guests. Nancy Pelosi walked onto the stage first, waving to the crowd, that familiar smile fixed on her face. The establishment Democrats applauded enthusiastically. She took her seat, adjusted her designer jacket, crossed her legs with practiced elegance. She looked confident, comfortable, completely in control. Then Tulsi Gabbard walked out. No wave, no smile. Just that calm, focused expression that comes from military training, from someone who'd been in actual combat zones and knew the difference between political theater and real stakes. She was wearing her Army uniform pin, deliberate choice. Reminder to everyone watching that while Pelosi had spent 37 years in air-conditioned offices, Tulsi had deployed to Iraq. While Pelosi had been attending fundraising dinners, Tulsi had been serving her country in uniform. The contrast was immediate and striking. Pelosi, 84 years old, representing the old guard, the career politician who turned public service into personal enrichment. Gabbard, young enough to be her granddaughter, representing a generation that was tired of the corruption, tired of the lies, tired of watching their leaders get rich while the country suffered. Tapper started with a softball question to Pelosi about Democratic Party unity. She launched into her prepared remarks, talking about values and coalition building, and the importance of standing together against extremism. Standard political boilerplate, delivered with that authoritative tone she perfected over decades. She was warming up, getting comfortable, setting the stage for what she thought would be a systematic dismantling of Gabbard's credibility. She turned to Tulsi with that patronizing smile. Representative Gabbard made a choice to leave our party at a critical moment. She abandoned us when we needed unity. She turned her back on democratic values, on the coalition we'd built, on the fight for democracy itself. And frankly, she's aligned herself with forces that seek to undermine everything we stand for. The audience applauded. Pelosi was hitting her marks perfectly. This was going exactly as planned. She continued, "So I think the American people deserve to understand why she made that choice. Was it principle, or was it something else? Because from where I sit, it looks like opportunism. It looks like someone who couldn't succeed within the Democratic Party deciding to attack it from the outside." Pelosi sat back, confident she just landed a devastating blow. The moderator turned to Tulsi for her response. This was the moment. Tulsi could have defended her decision to leave the party. She could have talked about principles and values and why she'd become an independent. That's what everyone expected. That's what Pelosi had prepared for. Instead, Tulsi opened a folder. She pulled out a document. She looked directly at Pelosi, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, almost conversational. "Madam Speaker, before we discuss my choices, let's discuss yours. Specifically, let's discuss your stock portfolio. Because I think the American people deserve to understand how someone accumulates $120 million in wealth on a congressional salary of $193,000 a year." The room went silent, not the polite silence of people waiting for the next speaker. The shocked silence of people who just realized they were about to witness something unexpected, something raw, something that was going to make headlines. Pelosi's smile didn't exactly disappear, but it changed. The confidence flickered, just for a second, but everyone saw it. Tapper looked nervous. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't the conversation CNN had planned. He started to interject, to redirect, but Tulsi kept talking. "You've served in Congress for 37 years, Madam Speaker. That's longer than I've been alive. In that time, you've become one of the wealthiest members of Congress. Your financial disclosures show a net worth of approximately $120 million. On a salary that's never exceeded $223,000 a year, even as Speaker. That's remarkable financial management." She held up the document so the cameras could see it. "Financial disclosure forms, official congressional records. Maybe you should write a book, Madam Speaker. How to become a centimillionaire on a government salary. I'm sure it would be a bestseller. Though I suppose the full title would need to include, and how to avoid insider trading charges while doing it." The audience erupted, half in shocked gasps, half in nervous laughter. This was not a typical political exchange. This was not the careful, diplomatic language politicians usually use. This was direct, specific, and devastating. And it was all backed up by documentation that Tulsi was holding in her hands. Pelosi tried to maintain her composure, but you could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. How to respond? Deny, deflect, attack. She started to speak, but Tulsi cut her off. Not rudely, just firmly. The way a commanding officer redirects a conversation. "Let's talk about your husband, Paul Pelosi. Successful investor, extraordinarily successful, almost suspiciously successful at timing his trades." Another document came out of the folder. "December 2020. Your husband purchased between $1 and $5 million in Tesla call options. That's a bet that Tesla stock would rise. This was documented in your required financial disclosures." She paused, let that information settle. 3 weeks later, President-elect Biden, about to take office, announced his infrastructure plan. The plan included massive subsidies for electric vehicles. Tesla stock soared. "Your husband made millions." Tulsi looked at Pelosi with an expression that wasn't quite a smile. Remarkable timing, almost like someone had advanced knowledge of what policies were coming. But that would be insider trading, wouldn't it? And you've assured everyone that you and your husband don't discuss your congressional work, so it must just be incredible luck. She pulled out another document. March 2021. Your husband bought over $1 million in tech stocks. Google, Amazon, Apple. These were companies facing potential antitrust legislation. Legislation that you, as Speaker of the House, had enormous influence over. Legislation that could have cost these companies billions. Another pause. That legislation never moved forward. It died in committee. Tech stocks soared. Your husband made millions more. The pattern was becoming clear now. Even the establishment Democrats in the audience were starting to look uncomfortable. This wasn't vague accusations. This was specific trades, specific dates, specific outcomes. And Tulsi had documentation for all of it. June 2021. $10 million in tech stocks purchased by your husband. Within weeks, major tech regulation bills that had been advancing through committees suddenly stalled. The bills died. The stocks went up. Your family made money. Tulsi spread out a timeline on the table in front of her, held it up so the cameras could capture it. Over 2 years, your husband made more than 50 significant stock trades. Almost all of them were profitable. Almost all of them were timed perfectly with legislative action that you had influence over. She looked directly at the camera now, speaking to the American people rather than just to Pelosi. The statistical probability of this happening by chance, of someone making 50 consecutive profitable trades that all align perfectly with congressional action, is essentially zero. We're talking about winning the lottery multiple times in a row. It doesn't happen by accident. Tulsi turned back to Pelosi. In July 2021, you were asked directly about banning congressional stock trading. You know what you said? You said, and I quote, "We're a free market economy. They should be able to participate in that." How convenient for someone whose family has made tens of millions of dollars from perfectly timed trades. The room was completely silent now. Even Tapper seemed frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let this play out. Pelosi's face had changed. The patronizing smile was gone. Her jaw was set tight, her eyes hard. She looked like someone who just realized she'd walked into an ambush. The New York Times documented this pattern, Tulsi continued, pulling out newspaper clippings. The Wall Street Journal documented it. Even left-leaning outlets that normally protect Democrats documented it. Your defense has always been the same. My husband makes his own investment decisions. I don't discuss my work with him. Madam Speaker, you expect the American people to believe that you and your husband of 6 decades don't discuss your work, that he just happens to make million-dollar bets right before you take action that affects those exact companies. Tulsi's voice dropped, became harder. That's not a marriage. That's a criminal conspiracy with a marriage license. The audience erupted again, but this time the applause was louder than the gasps. Something had shifted in the room. People were starting to realize they weren't watching a debate. They were watching an exposure. They were watching someone with receipts systematically document corruption that everyone in Washington had known about, but no one had dared to confront directly. Pelosi finally found her voice. Representative Gabbard, my husband's investments are completely legal and completely separate from my duties as Speaker. He's a private investor who. Martha Stewart went to prison for less. Tulsi cut her off cleanly. She made $45,000 on an insider trade. $45,000. She lied about it and went to federal prison. She lost her business empire. She became a convicted felon for $45,000. She leaned forward. Your family has made millions. Tens of millions, Madam Speaker, but somehow you're above the law. Somehow the rules don't apply to you. Tulsi's voice was steady, but the anger underneath was palpable. Martha Stewart couldn't host a television show anymore after her conviction. But you get to be Speaker of the House, while your family makes millions on trades that perfectly align with your legislative agenda. The woman who went to prison for a $45,000 trade lost everything. You make millions and face no consequences. She pulled out one more document, held it up. This is a letter from the Campaign Legal Center calling for an investigation into your stock trades. They documented pattern after pattern of suspicious timing. They used language like apparent conflicts of interest, which is how lawyers say, this looks like insider trading but we can't prove it yet. Tulsi looked directly at Pelosi, her military bearing evident in her posture, her tone, her unflinching gaze. But we all know what it is. Everyone watching knows what it is. You've used your position as Speaker to enrich your family. You've traded on inside information. You've made millions from your office. That's not public service, Madam Speaker. That's corruption. That's what organized crime looks like when it wears a designer suit and carries a gavel. Pelosi tried to respond, tried to pivot to Tulsi's decision to leave the Democratic Party, tried to regain control of the conversation. But Tulsi wasn't letting her off the hook. Answer the question, Madam Speaker. How did your husband know to buy Tesla options right before EV subsidies? How did he know to buy tech stocks right before you killed tech regulation? How did he make 50 consecutive profitable trades that all aligned with your legislative actions? She paused, waited. Either your husband is the luckiest investor in American history, or you're sharing insider information with him. Which is it? The silence stretched out. Pelosi's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She looked at Tapper as if hoping he'd rescue her. He looked away. She looked at her team in the wings, but what could they do? The evidence was on the table. The receipts were in Tulsi's hands. The American people were watching. Finally, Pelosi managed. This is a distraction from the real issues facing our country. Corruption is the real issue. Tulsi's voice was quiet now, but it carried through the silent room. The American people working 2 jobs to make ends meet while their elected representatives become millionaires. That's the issue. Small business owners following the rules while politicians get rich breaking them. That's the issue. Veterans sacrificing everything for their country while career politicians profit from war. That's the issue. She gathered her documents, organized them precisely. The American people deserve better than leaders who get rich off insider information. They deserve better than politicians who use their offices as personal ATMs. They deserve better than you, Madam Speaker. And that was just the opening round. Tulsi had barely gotten started. During the commercial break, you could see Pelosi's team swarming her. 5, 6 staffers all gesturing frantically, showing her their phones, whispering urgently in her ear. They were in damage control mode. The problem was there was no controlling this. Tulsi had come with documentation. She had dates, amounts, specific trades, timelines. You can't spin away evidence. You can't talking point your way out of facts. Tulsi sat calmly, reviewing her notes. She took a sip of water. She looked like a soldier who'd completed the first objective of a mission and was preparing for the next phase. Because that's exactly what this was. A mission. And she'd barely started. When they came back from break, Tapper tried desperately to steer towards safer ground. Let's discuss the events of January 6th and the subsequent investigation into. Perfect, Tulsi interrupted smoothly. Let's talk about January 6th, because Madam Speaker, you talk about it constantly. You've called it an insurrection. You've called it the worst attack on democracy since the Civil War. You've said it was terrorism, that it was planned, that it was an attempt to overthrow the government. She paused, let that hang in the air. I'm a combat veteran, Madam Speaker. I've served in Iraq. I've deployed to war zones. I've seen actual insurrections. I've seen actual attempts to overthrow governments. I've seen terrorism. Her voice was flat, factual. January 6th was a riot, a terrible, violent, disgraceful riot. But let's talk about your role that day. Let's talk about why it was allowed to happen. Pelosi's eyes went wide. This was not where she expected this to go. I had no role in. You were Speaker of the House. Tulsi's voice was firm. The Speaker has authority over Capitol Police. The Speaker controls their budget. The Speaker approves major security decisions. That's not my opinion, Madam Speaker. That's the job description. That's the law. She pulled out a document. This is testimony from former Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund. He testified under oath before Congress. He said he requested National Guard support multiple times in the days before January 6th. Multiple times. He said he was denied. He said the House Sergeant-at-Arms, who reports directly to you, rejected his requests. He said he couldn't get the resources he needed. Tulsi held up the document so the cameras could see it. Official congressional testimony. Chief Sund begged for help. He warned that something bad might happen. He asked for backup, and he was told no. She pulled out another document. This is a memo from the Department of Defense. It confirms that President Trump authorized 10,000 National Guard troops for January 6th. 10,000 troops. The Pentagon confirmed this. Trump's acting Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller, testified to this under oath. 10,000 National Guard troops were offered days before January 6th. Tulsi looked directly at Pelosi. Who rejected that offer? Your office, the Speaker's office. You said no to 10,000 troops. The audience was murmuring now. This wasn't the narrative they'd heard. The media had spent 2 years saying Trump refused to deploy the Guard, not that Pelosi refused to accept them. Let me walk you through the timeline, Tulsi said, pulling out a chart. In the weeks before January 6th, there were warnings everywhere. Intelligence warnings, social media chatter. The FBI issued warnings. The Department of Homeland Security issued warnings. Everyone knew something might happen. She pointed to dates on the timeline. January 3rd, Chief Sund requests guard support. Denied. January 4th, he requests again. Denied. January 5th, he makes a final request. Denied. Who denied these requests? The House Sergeant at Arms who answers to you. Tulsi's voice got harder. On January 6th, when the breach started, when Capitol Police were being overwhelmed, Chief Sund called begging for National Guard support. You know how long it took to get approval? Hours. It took hours while police were being attacked, while people were breaking into the Capitol, while the situation was spiraling out of control. She pulled out phone records, held them up. The timeline is documented. Chief Sund's calls, the delays, the bureaucratic runaround. And during those critical hours, where were you, Madam Speaker? What were you doing? Why did it take so long? Pelosi started to speak, but Tulsi kept going. After January 6th, you created the January 6th Committee. You handpicked every single member. When Republican leadership nominated members, you rejected them. You chose who would investigate, what they would investigate, how they would investigate. You controlled every aspect. Tulsi's voice dripped with contempt now. And you know what that committee never investigated? Your security failures, your decisions, your role. The committee spent millions of dollars, held dozens of hearings, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, but they never called you to testify. They never asked you the hard questions. Why? Because you controlled the investigation. She pulled out another document. The Capitol Police Inspector General issued a report on January 6th. It documented failures at the leadership level. It said there were intelligence failures, resource failures, response failures. It said someone should be held accountable. Tulsi looked at Pelosi. But you were never held accountable, were you? You were never even questioned. She held up one more document. This is a letter from Republican congressional leaders asking you to preserve all communications from January 6th. They specifically requested your emails, text messages, phone records, everything. Tulsi's voice was cold now. Those communications disappeared, gone, deleted, destroyed. You told investigators you didn't have them anymore. How convenient. The room was completely silent. This was explosive. This was contradicting 2 years of media narrative about January 6th. You had the authority to prevent January 6th, Tulsi said. You were warned. You were offered resources. You rejected them. Then when the attack happened, an attack you could have prevented, you used it for political theater. You spent 2 years investigating everyone except the person responsible for Capitol security. Yourself. Pelosi's face was red now. The security of the Capitol is not the sole responsibility. You controlled the budget, Tulsi interrupted. You controlled the resources. You approved or rejected major security decisions. You were offered 10,000 National Guard troops and you said no. Chief Sund begged for help and you denied him. Then when police officers were injured, when people died, when the Capitol was breached, you blamed everyone except yourself. Tulsi stood up, her military bearing unmistakable. I've commanded troops, Madam Speaker. I've been responsible for their safety. When something goes wrong on your watch, you don't get to blame everyone else. You take responsibility. Her voice was hard. But you've never taken responsibility for anything, have you? You failed to protect the Capitol. Then you covered it up by controlling the investigation and making sure you were never asked the hard questions. She looked at Pelosi with undisguised disgust. That's not leadership. That's cowardice. 2 rounds down, and Tulsi was just getting warmed up. Pelosi was visibly rattled now. The confident smirk was gone. The patronizing tone had disappeared. She looked like someone who'd stepped into what they thought was a casual conversation and discovered they were actually being deposed by a prosecutor who'd done years of research. Tulsi could see it, the cracks in the armor, the defensive posture. Good, because this next round was going to hurt. Let's talk about 2020, Tulsi said, her tone almost conversational now, which somehow made it more threatening. COVID lockdowns. Remember those, Madam Speaker? Small businesses destroyed. People couldn't work. Children couldn't go to school. People couldn't visit dying relatives in hospitals. But the rules didn't apply to everyone, did they? She pulled out a tablet, queued up video footage. August 31, 2020, San Francisco, a salon called eSalon SF. The city had banned indoor salon services, completely banned. Salons were closed, hair stylists were out of work, people were losing their businesses. Tulsi hit play. The security camera footage appeared on the screens throughout the studio, crystal clear, date and time stamped. Nancy Pelosi walking through a salon that was supposed to be closed, getting her hair washed and blown dry. No mask. Indoors. Completely violating the lockdown orders she'd publicly supported. That's you, Madam Speaker. Getting your hair done in a closed salon. No mask. Breaking the exact rules you supported imposing on everyone else. The footage continued playing. Pelosi chatting with the stylist, completely comfortable, completely casual, breaking the law like it didn't apply to her. The salon owner, Erica Hughes, released this footage. She was outraged, not because she's political. She wasn't. She was outraged because she'd been forced to close her business. Her employees were out of work. She was losing everything she'd built. And here was Nancy Pelosi, who supported those lockdowns, getting her hair done in secret. Tulsi let the footage run its full course. Then she turned to Pelosi. You know what happened next. You held a press conference. Not to apologize, not to acknowledge your hypocrisy. You said you'd been set up. You claimed the salon owner set you up. You demanded an apology from her. She pulled out news articles, spread them across the table. Erica Hughes received death threats, thousands of them. Your supporters found her information and terrorized her. They threatened to kill her. They threatened her family. They threatened to burn down her business, all because she exposed you breaking your own rules. Tulsi's voice was shaking with genuine anger now. That woman lost everything. She had to close her salon. She couldn't operate in San Francisco anymore. She left California entirely because she wasn't safe there. Your supporters drove her out of the state. She looked at Pelosi with fury. You destroyed that woman's life. She followed your lockdown rules. She closed her business. She sacrificed her livelihood. And when she exposed you breaking those same rules, you blamed her. You let your supporters terrorize her. You never apologized. You never took responsibility. You destroyed her life and you went right back on television calling for stricter lockdowns. Tulsi pulled out financial records. Meanwhile, you're worth $120 million. You have multiple homes, a mansion in Pacific Heights, a vineyard estate in Napa Valley, a residence in Washington, D.C. You didn't suffer during lockdowns, did you? You got your hair done. You attended private dinners. You lived your life in comfort while working people lost everything. She held up statistics. Do you know how many small businesses in San Francisco closed during COVID? 47%. Almost half of all small businesses gone forever. Restaurants, shops, salons, gyms. Thousands of jobs lost, lives destroyed, dreams crushed. Tulsi's voice was trembling with rage. And you supported every lockdown, every restriction, every mandate. You called people who questioned them selfish. You said they didn't care about saving lives. But you didn't follow your own rules, did you? You got your hair done in a closed salon. You attended a birthday party dinner at the French Laundry, one of the most expensive restaurants in the world, while telling people they couldn't see their families for Thanksgiving. She looked directly at the camera. This is who Nancy Pelosi is. Rules for thee, not for me. She'll destroy your business with lockdowns she doesn't follow. She'll ruin your life if you expose her hypocrisy. She'll demand you apologize for her breaking her own rules. Tulsi turned back to Pelosi. Erica Hughes was just a small business owner trying to survive. She wasn't political. She wasn't trying to make a statement. She just wanted people to know that the politician demanding they sacrifice everything was getting special treatment, and you destroyed her for it. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You're worth $120 million and you live in a mansion, but you'll lecture working people about sacrifice while getting your hair done in a closed salon. You didn't lose anything during COVID. You didn't suffer, but you supported policies that destroyed lives. And when one person, just one, exposed your hypocrisy, you tried to destroy her too. Pelosi attempted a response. That incident was blown completely out of proportion by a woman lost her business because of you. Tulsi's voice was quiet but cut like a knife. She lost her livelihood. She had to leave her home. She had to leave California because you couldn't admit you were wrong, because you couldn't apologize for breaking your own rules, because you used your power and your supporters to crush anyone who challenges you. Tulsi leaned back in her chair. That's who you are, Madam Speaker. That's what you do. You use your power to enrich yourself and crush anyone who gets in your way. Erica Hughes learned that the hard way. How many others are too afraid to speak up because they've seen what you do to your critics? 3 rounds. And Pelosi looked like she'd been through 3 rounds with a heavyweight champion. But Tulsi wasn't even close to done. The commercial break was longer this time. CNN needed to regroup. This wasn't going according to plan. This wasn't the civilized discussion about Democratic Party values they'd envisioned. This was a systematic destruction of Nancy Pelosi's credibility, backed by documentation, video evidence, and specific facts that even CNN's fact-checkers couldn't dispute. Pelosi's team was in full crisis mode. You could see them huddled around her, all talking at once, trying to figure out how to stop the bleeding. The problem was, there was no stopping it. Tulsi had clearly prepared for months, maybe years, for this moment. She had evidence for everything. She had receipts. And she was methodically working through what appeared to be a carefully organized plan to expose every major scandal of Pelosi's career. When they came back, Tapper looked like a man who'd aged 5 years in one evening. He tried to redirect. Perhaps we should discuss policy differences, areas where. Let's discuss the 2020 election, Tulsi interrupted smoothly. Specifically, October 2020, the Hunter Biden laptop story. Pelosi's face went pale. The New York Post published a story about Hunter Biden's laptop, Tulsi continued. Emails showing business dealings with foreign governments, messages discussing payments to the big guy, evidence of potential corruption and influence peddling. It was a major story from a major newspaper, published 3 weeks before a presidential election. She pulled out a timeline, and then something remarkable happened. Within hours, literally hours, that story was labeled Russian disinformation, not by intelligence agencies, not by investigators, by politicians, by you, Madam Speaker. Tulsi held up video clips. You went on CNN, MSNBC, all the networks. You said the laptop story was Russian disinformation. You said it was a Russian intelligence operation. You were very emphatic, very confident. You told the American people not to pay attention to it. She set down the clips. Then something else remarkable happened. 51 former intelligence officials signed a letter saying the laptop story, quote, has all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. That letter was immediately used by the Biden campaign. Social media companies used it as justification to censor the story. Tulsi's voice hardened. Twitter locked the New York Post's account for 2 weeks for publishing a true story. Facebook throttled distribution, made it impossible to share. YouTube removed videos discussing it. The story was effectively killed, censored, disappeared, based on that letter from intelligence officials. She pulled out the now famous letter, held it up. There was just one problem with all of this. The laptop was real. The FBI had it. They'd had it since December 2019, almost a year before the election. They knew it was authentic. They'd verified it, and they had briefed Congress. They'd briefed the intelligence committees. They'd briefed the Gang of 8. Tulsi looked directly at Pelosi. They'd briefed you. The room went dead silent. You knew the laptop was real, Madam Speaker. The FBI had shown you the evidence. You had access to classified intelligence about it. You knew it wasn't Russian disinformation, but you went on television anyway and lied. You called it Russian disinformation. You helped censor a true story from a major American newspaper 3 weeks before an election. She pulled out post-election polling data. After the election, independent pollsters surveyed Biden voters. They asked if the laptop story would have changed their vote. 17% said yes. 17%. That's millions of voters across swing states. More than enough to change the outcome in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia. Tulsi's voice was cold fury now. You interfered in an election. You and former intelligence officials and social media companies coordinated to censor true information that could have changed the outcome. You used your position and your access to classified information to lie to the American people about a legitimate news story. That's not protecting democracy, Madam Speaker. That's undermining it. That's election interference. Pelosi was shaking her head. We had intelligence assessments that suggested. You had intelligence that the laptop was real, Tulsi interrupted. The FBI authenticated it. They verified the emails. The intelligence officials who signed that letter had no access to the laptop, no access to the FBI's investigation, no basis for their claims. They signed it for political reasons, and you used it to justify censorship. She pulled out additional documentation. We now know that letter was coordinated with the Biden campaign. That's been confirmed. Antony Blinken, who became Biden's Secretary of State, helped organize it. The officials who signed it later admitted they had no evidence it was Russian disinformation. They just signed it anyway because it was politically useful. Tulsi stood up, her voice rising. Imagine if Republicans had done this. Imagine if Donald Trump had used former intelligence officials to call a true story about him Russian disinformation 3 weeks before an election. Imagine if social media companies had censored the New York Times based on a letter from Trump-aligned intelligence officials. You would have called it fascism. You would have called it the end of democracy. You would have impeached him for it. She pointed at Pelosi. But when you do it, it's fine. When you censor true information to help your candidate win, that's acceptable. When you coordinate with intelligence officials and tech companies to interfere in an election, that's protecting democracy. The hypocrisy is staggering. Tulsi gathered her documents. You helped censor a true story that could have changed the election. You lied about it being Russian disinformation when you knew it was real. You used your position and your security clearances to mislead the American people. And then you spent 4 years lecturing everyone else about protecting democracy and fighting misinformation. She looked directly into the camera. You are the misinformation. You are the threat to democracy you claim to be fighting against. 4 rounds, Pelosi looked shattered, but Tulsi had more ammunition. Pelosi was barely holding it together now. Her hands were trembling slightly. Her voice, when she tried to respond, lacked its usual commanding tone. Her staff was frantically signaling to end this, to find an excuse to leave, but walking away would be admitting defeat. She was trapped. Tulsi showed no mercy. She pulled out a new folder. This one was labeled Pelosi Family Business Interests. Let's talk about your family, Madam Speaker. Specifically, your son, Paul Pelosi Jr. Pelosi's eyes went wide. This was hitting close to home now. Your son has had a very interesting career, Tulsi said, opening the folder. He served on the boards of multiple companies over the years. Energy companies, tech companies, biotech companies. That's impressive for someone with no particular expertise in any of those fields. She pulled out corporate records. Let's start with Viscal Group. That's an energy company. Paul Jr. joined their board in the mid-2000s while you were Speaker. He had no energy experience, no relevant qualifications. His only real credential was that his mother was one of the most powerful politicians in America with oversight of energy policy. Tulsi let that sink in. Sound familiar? It should. It's the exact same pattern as Hunter Biden. Son of powerful politician joins board of energy company despite having no relevant experience. Gets paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. Everyone pretends it's legitimate business. She pulled out more documents. But it's not just energy companies. Paul Jr. has also been involved with companies doing business in China. He was associated with a firm that had significant business interests in China while you controlled trade policy and China relations as Speaker. Tulsi held up photos. Here's Paul Jr. traveling with you on official congressional delegation trips to Asia. Here he is meeting with foreign business leaders while on those trips. Here he is leveraging your position to make business connections. Her voice got colder. In 2020, during the pandemic, Paul Jr. was involved with a company that received PPP loans. That's pandemic relief money, Madam Speaker. Your son's company got government funds while you controlled COVID relief legislation. Another coincidence, I'm sure. She spread out a pattern analysis across the table. Your son has made millions from companies that had business before Congress. He served on boards in Ukraine and other foreign countries while you controlled foreign policy. He's traveled on your official trips and used your position to make connections. He's benefited from government programs while you controlled the spending. Tulsi looked at Pelosi with contempt. This is corruption, Madam Speaker, plain and simple. Your family has monetized your position. Your husband with his perfectly timed stock trades. Your son with his board positions and business dealings. This is a family enrichment scheme. She pulled out more documentation. You spent 4 years investigating Trump's family. Hearings about conflicts of interest. Investigations into foreign business dealings. Congressional inquiries into family members profiting from presidential positions. And the entire time, your own family was doing the exact same thing. Tulsi's voice rose. Where's the investigation into the Pelosi family? Where are the hearings about your son's board positions? Where's the outrage about your family making millions from your congressional position? Pelosi tried to defend herself. My son is a private businessman who. So was Hunter Biden, Tulsi shot back immediately. So were Trump's children. But somehow only your family gets a pass. Your son has no expertise in energy but sits on energy boards. He has no expertise in international business but does deals with Chinese companies. He has no expertise except being your son. That's his qualification. That's why he gets these positions and these payments. She pulled out financial analysis. Your family's net worth has exploded during your time in Congress, not just from stock trading, from your son's business dealings, from your husband's investments, from every possible way to monetize your position of power. Tulsi stood, her voice shaking with anger. You investigated Trump's family for far less than this. You called it corruption, conflicts of interest, abuse of power. But when your family does the exact same thing, that's just business. When your son profits from your position, that's acceptable. The double standard is obscene. She looked at the camera. Nancy Pelosi has spent 37 years enriching her family through her congressional position, stock trades, business deals, foreign connections, government contracts. Every possible avenue of corruption her family has exploited, and she has the audacity to lecture others about ethics and public service. 5 rounds of devastation, and Tulsi wasn't done. Tulsi's expression changed. You could see it in her eyes, the way they hardened. This round was personal in a different way. She was a combat veteran. She'd worn the uniform, deployed to war zones, seen what war actually costs. And she was about to confront someone who'd profited from sending others to fight. Madam Speaker, I'm a combat veteran. I've served in Iraq. I've been deployed to war zones. I've seen what war does. To soldiers, to civilians, to families, to countries. Her voice was steady, but there was emotion underneath. So let's talk about your enthusiasm for military interventions, and let's talk about your defense stock portfolio. She pulled out voting records. You've been in Congress for 37 years. In that time, you've voted for virtually every military intervention. Iraq in 2003, you voted yes. Libya in 2011, you supported it enthusiastically. Syria, you pushed for intervention. Yemen, no objection. Every defense budget increase, you voted yes. Every military authorization you supported. You've never met a war you didn't like. Tulsi held up the comprehensive voting record. You are the definition of a war hawk, and here's why. She pulled out financial records. Your family portfolio is heavily invested in defense contractors. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, General Dynamics. All the companies that make billions when America goes to war. All the companies whose stock prices soar when military budgets increase and when weapons get used. Tulsi spread out a detailed timeline. Let's look at the pattern. It's remarkably consistent. 2011, your family increases positions in defense stocks. Then you support military intervention in Libya. Defense stocks soar. Your family makes money. She pointed to more entries. 2013, more defense stock purchases. Then you push for intervention in Syria. You want to send troops, send weapons, establish no-fly zones. Defense stocks soar again. Your family profits again. Tulsi pulled out more recent data. Ukraine war. February 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. Within weeks, your family is increasing positions in defense stocks. Then you become one of the loudest voices calling for military aid to Ukraine. You push through package after package. Tens of billions of dollars in weapons, equipment, ammunition. Her voice was shaking now. Every bomb sent to Ukraine makes your family richer. Every missile, every artillery shell, every weapon system, it's all bought from companies your family has invested in. You're not supporting Ukraine out of principle, Madam Speaker. You're supporting war because it's profitable for your family. She held up documentation. When President Trump wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan, you opposed it. You called it reckless and irresponsible. You said we needed to stay. You know why? Because peace doesn't pay. When wars end, defense stocks go down. When troops come home, military budgets decrease. Your family loses money. So you opposed ending a 20-year war that cost thousands of American lives and trillions of dollars. Tulsi's military bearing was evident now. She stood straight, her voice commanding. I've been to war. I've seen young Americans come home in flag-draped coffins. I've attended military funerals. I've met with Gold Star families who lost their children. I've held the hands of veterans with PTSD. I know what war costs. She pointed directly at Pelosi. And you're profiting from it. You've never served. You've never worn the uniform. You've never been deployed. You've never been shot at. You've never seen combat. But you're eager to send other people's children to die in wars that make your family rich. Tulsi pulled out a letter. This is from Veterans for Peace, an organization of former service members. They're calling for an investigation into your defense investments. They've documented how your votes on military policy consistently benefit companies your family has invested in. They call it a conflict of interest. I call it what it really is: blood money. She looked at Pelosi with undisguised contempt. You profit from war. Your family buys defense stocks. Then you vote to send Americans to die in foreign conflicts. Every intervention you've supported has made your family richer. Every war you've pushed has lined your pockets. Tulsi's voice dropped. You're not a public servant. You're a war profiteer in a designer suit. Pelosi tried to respond. I support a strong national defense. I support defending American interests. Defending America is not the same as invading other countries to boost defense contractor profits, Tulsi interrupted. There's a difference. I wore the uniform. I deployed to the combat zones you send others to. I've been under fire while your family was checking their stock portfolio to see how much money they made from the war. Her voice was raw with emotion now. You've never sacrificed anything. You've just profited from other people's sacrifices. Every time a soldier dies, every time a bomb drops, every time a missile launches, your family makes money. You've turned American foreign policy into a profit center. You've monetized war. Tulsi shook her head. And you have the audacity to wrap yourself in the flag and call yourself a patriot. You're not a patriot, Madam Speaker. You're a war profiteer. And every veteran, every military family, every American who has sacrificed for this country should know exactly who you are and what you've done. 6 rounds. Pelosi looked destroyed, but Tulsi had one more load to fire. Pelosi looked like she'd been through actual combat. Her makeup couldn't hide the flush in her cheeks, the way her hands trembled when she reached for water, the defeat in her eyes. Her staff was practically pleading with her to leave, but she couldn't. Leaving would be surrender. She had to stay and take it. Tulsi pulled out legislative records. This was the final assault. Madam Speaker, you served as Speaker twice. From 2007 to 2011 under Presidents Bush and Obama. Then again from 2019 to 2023 under Presidents Trump and Biden. 6 years total as the most powerful person in the House of Representatives. Let's talk about your legacy. Let's talk about what you actually accomplished. She spread out the records. First term, you promised healthcare reform, immigration reform, infrastructure. You delivered the Affordable Care Act, though even that was deeply controversial and flawed. but at least it was legislation that attempted to address a problem. Tulsi set those aside and pulled out new documents. Let's focus on your second term. January 2019, you become Speaker again. Democrats control the House. You have power. You have opportunity. What did you do with it? She held up impeachment articles. You impeached President Trump twice. You spent your entire second term trying to remove a president you didn't like instead of passing legislation to help Americans. Tulsi pulled out a detailed breakdown. First impeachment, Ukraine phone call. You opened the inquiry in September 2019, held hearings for months, thousands of hours of testimony, tens of millions of taxpayer dollars, impeached him in December 2019. Senate trial in January 2020. Result: acquitted 52 to 48. It failed. She didn't pause. Second impeachment, January 2021. You impeached him for inciting insurrection after January 6th, held a vote just 1 week after the incident. No real investigation, no extensive hearings, just a political show. Senate trial in February 2021 after he'd already left office. Result: acquitted again 57 to 43. Failed again. Tulsi spread out timeline charts. For years as Speaker, you spent approximately 60% of your time and energy on impeachment proceedings, investigations, and attempts to remove Trump. 60%. What about the other 40%? She pulled out more legislative records. Border crisis, you did nothing. Immigration reform, you passed nothing substantive. Infrastructure, you obstructed Trump's plans, then took credit when Biden passed a smaller version years later. Healthcare improvements, none. Inflation, you made it worse with massive spending bills. Crime, you supported defunding police rhetoric and watched crime rates soar. Tulsi looked at Pelosi. Your legacy as Speaker is 2 failed impeachments and enriching yourself through stock trades. That's it. You didn't fix anything. You didn't solve any major problems. You spent 4 years consumed with hatred for Trump while actual crises went unaddressed. She pulled out news clippings from Pelosi's first day back as Speaker. You said, quote, "Nothing is off the table when it came to investigating Trump." You said that on day 1. You'd already decided to impeach him before you had evidence. This wasn't about oversight or accountability. It was revenge. Tulsi held up polling data. The first impeachment, public opinion was split. About half the country opposed it. The second impeachment, even less popular with independent voters. You did it anyway because you wanted to damage Trump politically, not because the evidence supported it. Her voice hardened. You know who opposed the first impeachment? Me. I was still a Democrat then, still in your caucus. And I voted present because I knew it was a political vendetta masquerading as constitutional duty. You were furious with me. You attacked me publicly. But I was right, wasn't I? The Senate acquitted him. Your impeachment failed because it wasn't based on truly impeachable offenses. Tulsi pulled out more records. You could have worked with Trump on infrastructure. He wanted to spend $1 trillion on it. He was willing to negotiate. You said no because you didn't want to give him a legislative win. You could have worked on immigration reform. He offered multiple compromise deals. You refused to negotiate in good faith. You could have addressed the border crisis. You did nothing. She stood. You put your personal vendetta above your responsibility to the American people. You wasted thousands of hours and millions of dollars on impeachments that were destined to fail. You accomplished nothing except dividing the country further and destroying any chance of bipartisan cooperation. Tulsi looked at the camera. Nancy Pelosi's legacy as Speaker is failure. Failed impeachments. Failed leadership. Failed policies. The only thing she succeeded at was enriching herself and her family. That's not a legacy to be proud of. That's a cautionary tale about what happens when personal ambition and hatred overwhelm duty. 7 rounds, 1 more to go, the final destruction. Tulsi took a deep breath. This was it. The final round. Time to end this not just with facts but with a statement that would define Nancy Pelosi's place in history. Madam Speaker, how old are you? Pelosi's eyes narrowed. That's not relevant to. You're 84 years old, Tulsi stated. You were first elected to Congress in 1987, 37 years ago. Ronald Reagan was president. The Berlin Wall was still standing. The Soviet Union still existed. The internet didn't exist in any meaningful way. I wasn't born yet. She let that information settle over the room. 37 years in Congress. 37 years of accumulating power, accumulating wealth, accumulating influence. You've become everything that's wrong with Washington. You're not just a politician, Madam Speaker. You're a symbol of a broken system. Tulsi pulled out district data. Let's talk about San Francisco, your district, the city you've represented for 37 years. How is it doing? She held up statistics, photos, reports. Homelessness crisis worse than it's ever been. Open-air drug markets. Fentanyl epidemic killing people in the streets. Property crime out of control. Small businesses fleeing the city. The middle class can't afford to live there anymore. Your district has become a dystopian nightmare for anyone who isn't wealthy. Tulsi's voice was sharp. You've represented San Francisco for nearly 4 decades and it's gotten dramatically worse. Not better, worse. But you've gotten richer. You started as a middle-class woman and became worth $120 million. Your district declined while you prospered. That's your legacy in microcosm. She pulled out more data. But it's not just your district, it's the Democratic Party leadership. You've held power in the party for decades. You control committee assignments. You control campaign funding. You decide which Democrats get support and which get crushed. You've created a gerontocracy where the same old faces stay in power forever, blocking younger members. Tulsi held up photos. You're 84. Steny Hoyer, your longtime second-in-command, is 85. Jim Clyburn is 84. The Democratic leadership is run by octogenarians who refuse to retire, who refuse to pass the torch, who refuse to let the next generation lead. She pulled out recent videos. Let's watch some of your recent speeches and appearances. The videos played. Pelosi stumbling over words, forgetting names, losing her train of thought mid-sentence, appearing confused about basic facts, repeatedly mixing up words and concepts, her age showing in ways that were impossible to deny. You're diminished, Tulsi said quietly. Everyone can see it. You're not as sharp as you used to be. You forget things, you get confused. You struggle to complete coherent sentences. But you're still running for re-election. At 84 years old, you're running for another 2-year term that would take you to 86. Tulsi walked closer to Pelosi. Why? Why are you still doing this? Because you can't let go. The power, the attention, the influence, the money, you're addicted to it. You can't imagine being Nancy Pelosi, private citizen. You've defined yourself by this position for so long that you don't know who you are without it. She pulled out poll numbers. Your approval rating in your own district is barely above 50%. Nationwide, you're deeply unpopular. But you don't care because you're in a safe district and you control enough money to crush any primary challenger who dares to oppose you. Tulsi's voice got louder. You represent everything wrong with American politics. You're a career politician who's never had a real job outside of politics. You've never built a business. You've never served in the military. You've never done anything except accumulate power. And you've used that power to become worth over $100 million while working people in your district can barely afford rent. She spread out all the documentation from the evening. You've profited from insider trading. You've enriched your family through corruption. You've profited from war. You've covered up your security failures. You've broken rules you imposed on others. You've interfered in elections. You've wasted years on failed impeachments. And you're too old to do the job effectively, but you won't retire because you're addicted to power. Tulsi walked back to her position, turned to face Pelosi directly. It's time for you to go, Madam Speaker. Time to retire. Time to step aside. Time to let someone who actually cares about fixing problems instead of enriching themselves have a chance. She gestured to the audience. The Democratic Party deserves better than you. Young Democrats trying to rise deserve better than you blocking them at every turn. America deserves better than octogenarians who can barely complete sentences running the country. Veterans deserve better than war profiteers sending them to die for stock portfolio gains. Small business owners deserve better than hypocrites who break the rules they impose. Working Americans deserve better than insider traders getting rich off legislation. Tulsi's voice was steady, final. Go home, Madam Speaker. Go to your mansion in Pacific Heights. Count your millions. Enjoy your vineyard. But get out of the way and let someone who actually cares about the country try to fix what you've broken. She pulled out one last document. This is a letter signed by over 300 former congressional staffers, people who worked in Democratic offices on Capitol Hill. They're calling for term limits and age limits for congressional leadership. They've seen the corruption up close. They've seen how the gerontocracy operates. They've seen how you maintain power, and they're calling for change. Tulsi held it up so cameras could see. Even the people who worked for Democrats think you should go. Even people in your own party are exhausted by your corruption, your age, your refusal to step aside. She set down the letter and looked at Pelosi one final time. You're 84 years old. You've been in power for 37 years. In that time, you've become fabulously wealthy while your district has become a disaster. You've enriched your family through corruption. You've profited from war. You've covered up scandals. You've abused your power. And you're still clinging to your seat because you can't imagine life without it. Tulsi's voice was quiet but devastating. The cruelest part is that you're staying in power past your expiration date, past the point where you can do the job effectively because you can't let go. You can't imagine being a private citizen. The power, the prestige, the influence, you need it like an addict needs a fix. And the Democratic Party and the country are paying the price for your addiction. She stood straight, her military bearing evident. History will not remember you as a trailblazer or a feminist icon. History will remember you as a corrupt politician who stayed too long and took too much. History will remember you as someone who enriched herself while her constituents suffered. History will remember you as a cautionary tale about what happens when we let people accumulate power without accountability, when we let them stay in office until they're physically and mentally unfit. Tulsi looked directly at the camera. It's time for Nancy Pelosi to retire. It's time for a new generation. It's time to end the corruption, the insider trading, the war profiteering, the family enrichment schemes. It's time for accountability. She turned back to Pelosi. Will you retire, Madam Speaker? Will you finally step aside? Will you do what's right for once? Or will you hold on to power until they pry it from your cold, dead hands? Pelosi tried to respond. Her mouth opened. Words started to form, but they came out jumbled, confused. She lost her train of thought mid-sentence, started over, lost it again. The cognitive decline that Tulsi had just highlighted was on full display. Finally, Pelosi managed, I've served this country with honor. These attacks are. You're a traitor to everything I've never. She trailed off, couldn't finish. The exhaustion was evident. The age was undeniable. The weight of all the evidence, all the exposure, all the documented corruption, it was too much. She looked like someone who just realized their entire legacy had been destroyed in a single evening. Tulsi's voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent room. You can't even defend yourself coherently anymore. That's perhaps the saddest part. You're staying in power past the point where you can effectively do the job. You can't complete thoughts. You forget basic information. You get confused. But you won't retire because you need the power more than the country needs competent leadership. She shook her head. The Democratic Party deserves better. America deserves better. Your constituents deserve better. It's time to go, Madam Speaker. It's time. The studio was silent, dead silent. Jake Tapper didn't even try to wrap up or summarize. What could he say? They'd all just witnessed something unprecedented in American political discourse. Not insults, not personal attacks, not vague accusations. A systematic, documented exposure of corruption spanning decades. Pelosi sat in her chair, looking small, diminished, defeated. The most powerful woman in American politics for 2 decades had just been dismantled by someone with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Someone with receipts, with evidence, with the moral authority of a combat veteran, and with the courage to speak truth to power. The debate, if you could call it that, was over, but the impact was just beginning. The video started spreading before they'd even left the studio. People in the audience were recording on their phones. CNN's own stream was being clipped and shared across every social media platform. Within minutes, literally minutes, hashtags were trending. Pelosi exposed. Time to retire. Receipts don't lie. Within 2 hours, the full debate had 60 million views across all platforms. Within 24 hours, over 100 million people had watched at least portions of it. This wasn't just a political debate going viral. This was a cultural earthquake. This was one of those rare moments that cuts through partisan divisions because the evidence is so overwhelming, so specific, so well documented that even people who disagree politically have to acknowledge what they're seeing. Time to retire Nancy trended #1 worldwide for 3 consecutive days. Not just in the United States, worldwide. The systematic exposure of corruption, the evidence-based destruction, the combat veteran confronting the war profiteer, the young outsider taking down the corrupt establishment insider. It resonated across every demographic, every political persuasion, every country. CNN's own post-debate analysis was devastating for Pelosi. Their fact-checkers who would have loved to dispute Tulsi's claims had to verify them instead. The stock trades, documented and accurate, the January 6 security failures, confirmed by multiple investigations and testimonies, the hair salon incident, video evidence, the laptop cover-up, now widely acknowledged even by mainstream sources, the family business dealings, public record. Even CNN, with all their institutional bias, couldn't spin this. Jake Tapper, looking exhausted and shell-shocked, said on air, "Whatever you think of Tulsi Gabbard's politics or her decision to leave the Democratic Party, she came prepared tonight. Every major claim she made was backed by documentation. This was not a typical political debate. This was a systematic presentation of evidence that raises serious questions about conflicts of interest and ethical standards in Congress." MSNBC tried harder to defend Pelosi, but even their hosts looked uncomfortable doing it. Rachel Maddow spent 20 minutes trying to contextualize the stock trades, trying to explain them away. But her own financial analysts admitted on air that the pattern was highly suspicious, and that the timing was statistically improbable without some form of insider information. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which had despised Pelosi for years, absolutely piled on. They'd been waiting for someone to take her down, and Tulsi had done it. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "Some of the questions raised tonight deserve serious answers. Congress members shouldn't be trading individual stocks, period." Bernie Sanders, when asked about the debate by reporters, said, "I've been saying for years that members of Congress should be banned from stock trading. There are clear conflicts of interest." The most significant reaction came from Pelosi's own district. Within 48 hours, a local poll showed her approval rating had dropped 18 points. Suddenly, 65% of San Francisco voters said she should not run for re-election. A progressive primary challenger announced her campaign within 72 hours, specifically citing the corruption and ethical questions exposed by Tulsi. Major donors started backing away. The invincible machine that Pelosi had built was crumbling. The financial and legal impacts were immediate and severe. Multiple ethics complaints were filed with the House Ethics Committee regarding the stock trades. The Campaign Legal Center formally requested a Department of Justice investigation into potential violations of the Stock Act. The SEC announced it was reviewing trading patterns of congressional members and their spouses, and Nancy Pelosi's name was specifically mentioned in the press release. Her power in the House evaporated almost overnight. Members who'd been afraid to cross her suddenly found their courage. Committee chairs started making decisions without consulting her. Young Democrats who'd been terrified of her retribution began speaking out. Within a week, 3 sitting Democratic members publicly called for her to resign from Congress entirely. The speaking circuit dried up instantly. Universities that had paid her $50,000 per appearance canceled invitations. Corporate events found other speakers. The demand for Nancy Pelosi's wisdom and experience disappeared when people realized that wisdom had been corrupted and that experience had been used primarily for personal enrichment. Her book deal, the one about leadership and public service she'd been working on, was canceled by the publisher. They released a carefully worded statement about reconsidering the project in light of recent developments. Translation: we can't publish a book about ethical leadership from someone who's just been exposed as corrupt. But perhaps the most symbolically devastating moment came 2 weeks after the debate. Nancy Pelosi held a press conference to announce she would not seek re-election in 2026. She claimed it was her decision, that she wanted to spend more time with family, that she'd accomplished everything she set out to do. But everyone knew the truth. Everyone understood what had really happened. Tulsi Gabbard had ended her career. At the press conference, Pelosi looked diminished. Not just physically, though at 84 she looked every single year of her age, but spiritually, emotionally, the fire was gone. The power that had sustained her, that had driven her for 37 years, had been extinguished. She answered a few softball questions, dodged the hard ones, and left quickly. No celebration, no tributes, just a quiet, ignominious end to a career built on corruption and maintained through fear. The Democratic establishment tried to salvage her legacy. They issued statements thanking her for her service, praising her historic achievements, calling her a trailblazer for women in politics. But the statements were perfunctory, obligatory, hollow. Everyone knew what she really was. Tulsi had made absolutely certain of that. 6 months later, the Department of Justice investigation into congressional stock trading was still ongoing, and Pelosi's name appeared repeatedly in the subpoenaed documents. Her lawyer issued statements claiming she'd done nothing wrong, that all trades were legal, that she looked forward to clearing her name. But the evidence was overwhelming. The pattern was undeniable. And unlike in the past, she didn't have the power to make investigations go away. Her district, meanwhile, elected a 38-year-old progressive Democrat who ran explicitly on ethics reform, term limits, and banning stock trading by members of Congress. In her victory speech, the new Congresswoman said, "The era of corruption is over. The era of accountability has begun. Nancy Pelosi's San Francisco is ending. We're building something better." Tulsi Gabbard, for her part, didn't gloat. When reporters asked her about the debate and its aftermath, she simply said, "I presented facts." Nancy Pelosi's career was destroyed by her own actions, not by me. I just made sure everyone knew what she'd done. That's what accountability looks like. But privately, those who knew Tulsi said she felt vindicated. She'd spent 6 years in Congress watching the corruption, watching the hypocrisy, watching the war profiteering. She'd watched good people get crushed by the machine while corrupt politicians thrived. She'd left the Democratic Party because she couldn't stomach being part of it anymore. And she'd finally had the opportunity to expose the worst of it in the most public, most documented, most devastating way possible. The debate became required viewing in political science classes across the country. The Gabbard-Pelosi confrontation was analyzed for its effectiveness, its use of evidence, its rhetorical strategy, its impact on public discourse. Professors used it to teach students about accountability, about how to present evidence, about the difference between political attacks and factual exposure, about the power of documentation. But for ordinary Americans, the lesson was simpler and more powerful. They'd watched a corrupt politician get exposed by someone with integrity. They'd watched a war profiteer get confronted by a combat veteran. They'd watched an octogenarian career politician get called out by someone young enough to represent the future. They'd watched the establishment get dismantled by an outsider who had nothing to lose. And they'd watched Nancy Pelosi, the most powerful woman in American politics for 2 decades, crumble under the weight of her own corruption. If you found this story compelling, if you believe in accountability for our elected officials regardless of party, hit that subscribe button right now. We need millions of people to see this. We need everyone to understand how the system actually works. Share this video with everyone who's tired of career politicians getting rich while working Americans struggle. Drop a comment below about whether you think Congress should have term limits, whether members should be banned from stock trading, whether there should be age limits for leadership positions. Because after this exposure, after this devastating presentation of evidence, those questions aren't going away. The receipts don't lie. The evidence is overwhelming. And Tulsi Gabbard made sure the entire world could see it. This is what happens when someone with nothing to lose, someone with integrity, someone who's actually served their country in uniform, decides to speak truth to power. This is what happens when someone does their homework, gathers their evidence, and refuses to back down. This is what accountability looks like. Nancy Pelosi's era is over. The dynasty she built on corruption, on insider trading, on war profiteering, on family enrichment schemes, it's crumbling. A new generation is rising, one that's tired of the lies, tired of the double standards, tired of watching their leaders get rich while the country suffers. And it all started on that CNN stage, under those bright lights, when a combat veteran with a folder full of receipts decided that enough was enough. The age of corruption is ending. The age of accountability has arrived, and Americans finally got to see what happens when someone with courage decides to expose the system for exactly what it is. Nancy Pelosi thought she was going to destroy Tulsi Gabbard that night. Instead, Tulsi Gabbard used facts, evidence, and moral courage to end Nancy Pelosi's career. Not with insults, not with lies, with truth, with documentation, with receipts. And that's the most powerful weapon of all.